Okay, today we're going to continue with our study of the Gospel of Mark. And last week we talked about the cost of discipleship. In other words, when we follow Jesus, there is a cost, and that cost usually comes in the form of either a sacrifice or being able to persevere and endure through difficult times, trials and tribulations, and to continue to maintain our faith through all those situations, that life brings our way. And again, I guess you could characterize, the cost of discipleship in terms of being a Christian is a life of giving. Okay, the whole life of giving, giving to others, a sense of offering. And again, a sense of sacrifice. I mean, the best example we have in terms of sacrifice is the sacrifices that parents have made for their children. The sacrifices of, making sure that they do everything they can to give them a good education and so on and so forth. Sacrificing, say, for example, certain ambitions in life, certain desires in order to benefit another, is part of the whole sense of a life of giving. And so, it's not to be exclusively and totally a life of getting. Asking that perennial question, what is in it for me? What am I going to get out of this? How much is it going to cost me? Is a big question. And sometimes, these questions are valid, they can be asked. But when it comes down to making sacrifices, we always see the sacrifices we make as Christians in the light of the sacrifice that Jesus made for us, which was to give his life and to have himself subjected to the powers of the world, the powers of the world. And we know the apostles, for the most part, in the very beginning, probably had it in their minds that they were going to get something out of this, get a reward of some kind, get an important position in God's kingdom. It's just like the James and John, and mom is there and saying, hey, look, can my sons sit on your right and your left and so on. And so she's had this vision that, they're going to get something as a reward of following this Jesus in this kingdom that they still thought and understood to be in a worldly sense, So, and that's part of human nature. And so they had to learn the whole sense of the cost of discipleship in terms of sacrifice. Okay, and so we'll take a kind of a look at that again. If we go to the Gospel of Mark, okay, and we go to 10:45, chapter 10, verse 45, we see this very much telling us what Jesus did in terms of his being here on earth. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so that sums it up. It's a sense that Jesus is giving. Okay, he is serving. And so it's not about his grandeur, in terms of being a worldly king, and ruling over a worldly kingdom. And this whole sense of giving his life as a ransom for many, ransoming us from evil and, of course, from the original sin and the weakness of Adam and Eve that continue to be perpetuated down through the centuries, and ransom in that regard. Part of that ransom, of course, was when Jesus was tempted in the desert and offered all kinds of worldly pleasures and worldly powers. He refused all that. So that was kind of like his ranting himself in the sense that the devil or Satan wanted to take control over him and everything that, he was going to do. As arrogant as the devil was, he went about and did that, for many different adverse, negative, evil reasons. Let's put it that way. Okay, now, when we see also in the in this whole sense of Jesus, being a servant, we also come to understand that in verses 43 and 44, but it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you, right, will be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slaves of all. Well, that completely turns upside down the whole concept or the idea of worldly ambition. Worldly ambition is all about being on top. It's all about, you being served, people at your beck and call. And of course, in all those, situations of, the great kings in all the ancient empires, the great kings had slaves, they had, concubines, they had everything and everybody who was going to meet even their most minute needs. Okay, so we see that whole sense that's totally what not Jesus was about. And he's asking that. The cost of discipleship is basically what he's saying. You need to be like me. You need to serve. You can't be striving ambitiously for worldly greatness. Okay? And so we see that, of course, very clearly. Now, if we go to Mark chapter 8, verse 34, we also see this sense, and this is, of course, part of the conditions of discipleship, the cost of discipleship. He says, he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Okay, that is very clear. It is a very strong, indication that, if you're going to follow me, you need to face the reality that it's not going to be easy at times. It's not going to be easy at times. And since it's not going to be easy at times, it's most probably going to be because you're up against the ways of the world. That's what it comes down to. That's what it comes down to. Okay. And so anyway, so we see this life, this cost of discipleship, this sacrifice, this ransoming, everything we see that Jesus is presenting to the world and presenting to his apostles and all those who were following him, is that the life he's calling them to is a life that is opposite of a life of preoccupation and selfishness. Okay. And being preoccupied with oneself, being self-absorbed, being, selfish. It's like, well, I need to get all I can possibly get, here and now before it's too late. And of course, that's all part of, human nature, to want to tend to get as much as you possibly can get for yourself. That very strongly is a temptation in terms of human nature. And so that what goes along with that, if we take a look at, again, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verse 35, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and that of the gospel will save it. Well, what does he mean by that? The apostles couldn't pick up on that right away. It was just hard to take, and it was hard to absorb, which means that, the costs of discipleship in following Jesus may require the loss of your life. And of course, we see this exemplified in the life of the martyrs, okay, who did not deny their belief in Jesus Christ. And we saw this in the persecution of the early church. Because a lot of the emperors and a lot of the rulers at the time said, look, we'll make a deal with you. You go ahead and worship this idol instead of this man Jesus, whoever he was, and we'll spare your life. Okay? Well, that would, in human nature, that would be, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, well, hey, I'll worship anything just as long as it saves my life, But that wasn't it. The Christian said, no, I'm not going to deny Jesus Christ. I believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, my Lord and Savior. Okay, so what happened was, well, they went and killed him. Okay, that's the cost of discipleship in terms of the most extreme sacrifice. And that is, of course, what we characterize in our faith as martyrdom. Okay, and so with that realization, we have to understand we can't close ourselves off from the needs of others. And that's clearly depicted several times, in the Gospels. It's like, share. Like, say, for example, if you're having something to eat. Let's say you're having something to eat. Okay. You went out to like a little fast food place, and you went with your brother and some of your friends, and all your friends and you bought like hamburgers and French fries, okay? But then your little brother, for some reason spent his money on baseball cards, and so he doesn't have any money for lunch, and so anyway, so you're basically, having lunch, and everybody's eating. And you're eating your hamburger and your French fries, and your little brother says to you, can you give me something to eat? What are you going to do? You're going to give him something to eat, okay? And so the thing is, but you could possibly say, you ain't getting nothing. You're not going to get anything to eat because you wasted your money on baseball cards. So, yeah. And the reason why I said that is that's an example that I had in my life. Now, I make a confession. I wouldn't give my brother anything because he spent it on baseball cards. And then my brother told my dad, and my dad said, Mike, you should have given your little brother something. He was hungry. He was hungry. Okay? So I learned that lesson, is that you can't close yourself, off from the needs of others. So that's a little personal example that I've given to you in all of my great humility. Okay? So anyway, okay, so take a look at that then. Now Peter, okay, Peter always seems to be in the limelight. Okay, he speaks up. He's the first person to say something. He always steps forward. Well, obviously he's exhibiting all the leadership qualities that Jesus picked up on right away. And so anyway, but then Peter, okay, made mistakes. It wasn't perfect. Jesus didn't pick him because, Peter, you're perfect. He didn't say that, okay? So if we go to again, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, and we go to 32, verse 32. He spoke of this openly. Jesus spoke this openly about his sacrifice, his life, his passion, death, and resurrection. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. In other words, he's telling Jesus, that ain't going to happen to you. That's not going to happen to you. Let me assure you, you're the man. And since you're the man, you're not going to let them hurt you, let alone crucify you. So I'm paraphrasing Peter's thinking. But anyway, at this, Jesus turned around, looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." So there you go. Human thinking often needs to be corrected in order to get a sense of the way God is thinking. And Jesus tells us the way God thinks. Okay, so that's perfectly clear. So Peter, obviously was corrected very strongly. Okay, now, so the key is this, okay? We talk about the key to things, the main point, the things that need to be recognized very strongly. And this is the reality, okay? This is the reality. Victory, in terms of the kingdom of God, victory can be realized only in conflict. You take a look at anything that's ever happened in the world, every war, every revolution, any attempt to bring change to a society or to the world. When we talk about victory, it can only come after there's been a tremendous conflict. I remember, seeing on newsreels, the celebrations after victory over Japan, right? People out in the streets rejoicing, jumping up and down. No more war. We won. We're victorious. Everybody happy. The soldiers are coming back home. They survived, okay? But that was after tremendous bloody conflict, And it was the same way, because with victory in Europe. The same way with victory in Europe. And so that's the key to this whole sense of the Christian struggle in the world. Victory can be realized only in conflict. Okay, now, it's also characterized in this way, which is very, very clear, and this is a reality. The Spirit, sometimes the spirit of a person, fights against Satan. And of course, that's a very stark reality. The spirit. We know that Satan prowls the world like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour, okay? So we know he's having an influence. I mean, we can't really deny that. There's a lot of people who don't want to recognize that or see that. But we know that if we're talking about evil and the personification of evil in Satan and all of his, fallen angels, that they're active in the world. And it's important to have a sense of discernment as to how that may be happening. But to do it with good discretion and common sense. To not overemphasize or give any power to Satan, by overemphasizing or giving the impression that Satan is more powerful than God, more powerful than Jesus. So that's why the church is very careful to approach this whole idea of what Satan does and what the demons do and the fallen angels do, with a sense that is balanced, okay, and not overemphasizing or giving attention to him. Okay, so the church needs to use a lot of discretion in identifying, what is truly demonic. Okay, so that needs to be approached with caution. But we know very clearly that Jesus opposes demons. He opposed demons, these evil entities that exist in the spiritual realm. But also look, what it makes it even more complicated. Okay, Jesus opposes demons and the Pharisees. So Jesus, look what he's up against. He's up against demons, and he's up against powerful religious authorities. Can we say that the Pharisees were in cooperation, with demons? Well, we certainly need to be cautious in making any kind of a direct connection, okay? But Jesus definitely dealt with the tremendous damage that demons did in individual people, obviously, in casting out demons, okay? And what we can say about the Pharisees, is obviously they were not possessed, or, they were not, of course, being dominated or controlled by demons, but the very fact that they were opposing Jesus means that they were basically acting out of the ways of the world. Okay. And how, evil and the ways of the world, complement each other sometimes is very clearly seen. Okay, so this is what we see. There's a lot against Jesus, not only, the powers, of evil, but the powers of the ways of the world, the flesh, and the devil. Okay? And so Jesus is up against the world and the devil. Okay? And then, of course, there's the whole aspect of the flesh, too, in the sense of Jesus, saving the poor little woman caught in adultery from being stoned to death. Obviously, she was subjected to the influences and the temptations of the flesh. So there's an example there. So the world, the flesh, and the devil. Okay? And so we see this be operating very, 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 very clearly. Okay. Now, the disciples must realize, the disciples must continue to struggle until the end. That's what it was all about. Okay. The disciples must continue to struggle until the end. Now we know that they were all martyred, except for John. Okay? But we know, of course, they entered into glory as a result of their sacrifice. They gave the ultimate, just like Jesus did. They gave their lives. And then John was given a special assignment to take care of his mother. And so he did not, die a martyr's death. Okay. Now we go to something that is extremely powerful. I had mentioned it before, but I want to spend a little bit more time on it because it associates the connection between the New Testament and the Old Testament. Okay. Because we need to know that there's a connection. I mean, they're not two exclusive books. They're tied together. Matter of fact, when we talk about designating something as the Old Testament and the New Testament, sometimes we get a sense that they're separate, but they're not. It's a continuum. Okay. So in that sense, the Old Testament and the New Testament, if we were not to use the words old and new, it would be a seamless garment. That's the best way to characterize it. A seamless garment, totally related, back and forth. Okay. So now what I'm going to read is, of course, I'm going to read the Transfiguration Scene. Now, the Transfiguration Scene is a very powerful scene, very mystical, okay, and very much in light of the continuum of what's going on in salvation history. And what we would characterize again as the relationship or the interrelationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, so this is what we've got going here. Chapter 9, verse 2 to 9 is this. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain, apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his disciples and his clothes became dazzlingly white, such as no fuller on earth could bleach them. Then Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, Rabbi, there goes Peter speaking up, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He hardly knew what to say. They were so terrified. Then a cloud came, casting a shadow over them. Then from the cloud came a voice. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone but Jesus alone with them. Now, if you put yourself in the shoes of the 2 apostles, right? We see, of course, Peter, James, and John. It's like I'm sure they're saying to themselves, "What was that all about?" What was that all about? Because they're kind of dazzled by everything. Absolutely mystified by it all, not knowing how to interpret it. And then you got Peter trying to interpret it, and he thinks it's going to be a time where they're going to have to get together for a couple of days. So he's got this working in his own mind, which is fine. That's to be expected. And so when we see this experience of the Transfiguration, we see Moses and Elijah, 2 of the most prominent people in the Old Testament. Okay, Moses and Elijah. And so we're given an indication that there's a connection taking place here. Okay, there's a fulfillment taking place here. Okay, now the Transfiguration. The Gospel of Mark answers the question of Jesus' identity. Okay, that's what the Gospel of Mark is all about. It's like, he is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He is the fulfillment. He is the kingdom come on earth. Okay, that's the message of Mark. But we need to take a little bit of an interesting look at the connections here. Okay, now notice it says that Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain. High mountain. Okay. Well, there's a lot of references in the Bible to mountains. Okay, mountains. Because there's something that always happens on a mountain. Okay. There's a whole sense of aboveness when you're on a mountain. When you're on a mountain, it's like you're looking down on the whole world. Have you ever been on top of a mountain? Okay. When you've been on top of a mountain, there's this sense that you can see everything around you for miles and miles on end. There's something about a mountain. And sometimes we can see things clearly from a mountain. Let me get up higher so I can see what's going on. How many times do you see a concert or something, right? Or you go to a big event and mom and dad, you put the little kid on their shoulders so they can see what's going on. So they can see it higher, higher, higher. It's all about getting up higher so you can see what's going on all around you and far beyond what you would see when you were on the ground. It's very clear, okay? Okay, now let's take a little closer look at this, okay? Moses. Let's talk about Moses since he's mentioned in the Transfiguration. Let's talk about Moses, okay? Moses gave the law from a mountain, right? Okay, let's take a look at that. Let's go back to Exodus. Okay, we go all the way back to the book of Exodus. I will do that all the way back to the book of Exodus, okay? Chapter 19, let's see, here we go, chapter 19, verses 16, okay. On the morning of the third day, there were peals of thunder and lightning, and a heavy cloud over the mountain, and a very loud blast of the shofar. That's like a horn. So that all the people in the camp trembled. But Moses led the people out of the camp to meet God. And they stationed themselves at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was completely enveloped in smoke because the Lord had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose from it as though from a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blast of the shofar grew louder and louder while Moses was speaking, and God was answering him with thunder. Boy, is that not dramatic or what? You couldn't put that more perfectly in terms of the power of God. And what's going to happen? Dun, 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 dun. It's going to be the Ten Commandments, right? That's what's coming next. This is it, man. I'm telling you the way it is, okay? And it's interesting that takes place, all on a so-called mountain, okay? Well, that's just an example, okay? Well, now, Elijah, who was also mentioned, right, prophesied from a mountain. Elijah prophesied from a mountain. Isn't that interesting? Okay, let's see. Let's take a look at that. We go to 1 Kings. There you go. 1 Kings, okay, chapter 19, verse 9 and on. It says this. There he came to a cave, which is probably on a mountain, right? There he came to a cave where he took shelter. But the word of the Lord came to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been most zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. But the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They have destroyed your altars and murdered your prophets by the sword. I alone remain, and they seek to take my life." Then the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. The Lord will pass by. There was a strong and violent wind, rending the mountains and crushing rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, a light, silent sound. When he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. A voice said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been most zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. But the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They have destroyed your altars and murdered your prophets by the sword. I alone remain, and they seek to take my life." The Lord said to him, "Go back. Take the desert road to Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king of Aram." So we see that Isaiah was given the task. After he encountered the Lord told him what to do. On the mountain with Moses, the Lord told him what to do. Okay? In the Transfiguration, Jesus knew what he had to do. And Elijah and Moses knew that what Jesus was going to do would make their lives worthwhile and fruitful as the gates of heaven were going to be opened. And that's what's joyous about the Transfiguration and this magnificent encounter between Moses, Elijah, and Jesus with the witnesses of the apostles. You know, Peter, James, and John got to witness this. But they didn't understand it till later, obviously, of course. Okay. So taking all that into account, Jesus makes a connection. Jesus connects with the men who represent Israel's heritage of the law and the prophets. They were the two main ones of the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. They represented the heritage of the people, the chosen people. Okay. And the law that the people broke many, many times. But God did not abandon them. But it took someone to bring them back. There always needs to be somebody to bring us back when we go astray. That's the way the life of faith is. Okay. And the prophets. Who are the prophets of today? Interesting question, rhetorical question. Who are the prophets of today? You know, very interesting. Okay, very interesting. Now, as we continue on, we know it's very clear that the disciples misunderstand. They misunderstand a lot. But there's one thing that's important, though. They're still with them. They're still with Jesus. They don't understand. And they even misunderstand, like Peter. Peter misunderstood what Jesus was saying about his passion, death, and resurrection. Peter had his own ideas, which Jesus identified as the ways of the world and not the ways of God. Okay, so we see that operating here. And so Jesus very simply fulfills the law and the prophets. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Okay, he's the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. How does he fulfill? How does he fulfill the law and the prophets? This is the key. Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets. How does he do that? Jesus fulfills the law of the prophets by enduring suffering. That's the key. He endures suffering. Okay. Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets by enduring suffering. So Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets, And this is how we can take a look at that. In the Transfiguration, okay, what I just read, back in chapter 9 of the Gospel of Mark, okay, we can go back there, okay, yeah, chapter 9, okay, we go back there. Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets, because we see in Mark chapter 8, okay, Mark chapter 8, and we see that, there we go. We have Mark chapter 9, okay, verse 8. It says this. Okay. Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets, because it says in Mark chapter 9, verse 8, suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone, but Jesus alone with them. So now Jesus is standing alone. The whole focus is on him. The whole purpose lies on his shoulders. So he's alone. He's alone. Okay? And then, but at the same time, in chapter 9, verse 7, there's a divine affirmation where it says, then a cloud came, casting a shadow over them. Then from the cloud came a voice. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And then Jesus stands alone. So he is the only one who will speak. On behalf of all the prophets, on behalf of all the sacrifices that were made down through the centuries, the ultimate task that Jesus is about to undertake, he undertakes alone. That's the burden. That's the cross. That's the cross. Okay, and we see that. Okay? So Jesus' kingly power, if you want to call it, Jesus' kingly power fulfills the law and the prophets, again, as I mentioned, by enduring suffering. He's going to have to suffer. He knows that. The apostles don't realize that yet, but that's what they are going to have to face. And that brings us to something that's very important in the Bible, in life, in the lives of everybody out there, in our own lives. There's this one thing that can disrupt everything. There's the one thing that can ruin everything. And that is fear. 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 Okay? And so anyway, when we think about that, fear, okay, that is probably one of the most uncomfortable feelings a human being can possibly have, is the powerful feeling of fear. Wanting to run, wanting to get away, wanting to react, protect, sometimes even wanting to destroy out of fear. Sometimes even wanting to kill out of fear. And so I'm going to end there today, and we'll take this up again, of course, next week. Same time, same place, of course, here in the chapel, 11 o'clock Thursday. Because this is what we need to see more clearly now. Now that Jesus is going to suffer, okay, now that he's going to give the ultimate sacrifice, and the apostles are going to see all this happening and don't understand it, what do you think they're going to be filled with? Fear. So we're going to talk about that. We're talking about the fear that the apostles were going to have to endure and how they were going to have to overcome it. Because when we're afraid, we've got to find a way to overcome that fear. In a good way, in a just way, in a moral way, in an ethical way, how to deal with fear. Okay. And so anyway, so we'll go ahead and, like I say, continue with this next week as we continue on with the Gospel of Mark. and everything that continues to be part and parcel of our scripture study. So